Does the heart dance? Testing house and classical music effects on heart rate. Salvatore Ramsahoi. General Project Introduction. Hello, my name is Salvatore Ramsahoi, and today I'll be presenting my research on how music genre influences short-term changes in heart rate. This project addresses a common claim that energetic music can elevate heart rate, while calmer music may have the opposite effect. Although this idea is often mentioned in everyday contexts, such as fitness settings and social media, controlled data supporting it is limited. My research focuses broadly on the relationship between auditory stimuli and physiological responses, specifically examining whether brief exposure to house music versus classical music produces different acute changes in heart rate. In order to get a good idea of what kind of research had already been conducted around the field, I took a look at three different studies from the last 2 decades pertaining to the subject. The first study pertained to the effect of classical music on heart rate, blood pressure, and mood. The first study found that classical music significantly influences heart rate and blood pressure. Specifically, when participants listened to a fast classical piece, their mean heart rate increased relative to rest, and conversely, when participants listened to a slow classical piece, their mean heart rate decreased relative to rest. Similar trends were observed for blood pressure. Fast music increased both systolic and diastolic blood pressure compared to rest, while slow music decreased them. The second study that I looked into was regarding the effect of music on heart rate alone. In this study, participants were asked to listen to one fast song and one slow song. Heart rate was measured just before and right after each song was listened to. The results were quite obvious in showing that one slow song decreased the heart rate of 93% of the participants, while the fast song increased the heart rate of 100% of the participants. The third research study I chose to look into had to do with cardiovascular effect of musical genres. In this study, participants either listened to a piece by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart or a piece by ABBA. Classical music was shown to produce a significant decrease in blood pressure and heart rate. In contrast, the pop piece by ABBA was shown to not produce any significant reductions in heart rate or blood pressure. Therefore, the effects seemed independent of participants' prior listening habits or music preferences, suggesting that the physiological changes, heart rate and blood pressure, were more tied to features of the music itself, such as tempo and composition style. The authors noted that certain musical characteristics, such as slow tempo, smooth dynamics, and consistent rhythm, tend to be especially beneficial for cardiovascular relaxation. Research question and hypothesis. Many people claim that energetic music can raise your heart rate, but there is limited controlled evidence to support this idea. To investigate this claim, my research question asks, does listening to house music versus classical music produce different short-term changes in heart rate? Based on this question, my hypothesis predicts that house music will cause a larger mean increase in heart rate than classical music during a 3-minute listening period. This study will compare the change in heart rate after listening to each genre to determine whether music type influences immediate physiological responses. Methods 1. This study used a single subject with in-person design in which the main participant completed all the trials. All data were collected with the same wrist heart rate monitor, a smartphone containing pre-selected house and classical tracks, a decibel meter app, and the same pair of headphones.
Every session took place in a quiet, temperature-stable room where the participant sat in the same chair to keep conditions consistent. Before each trial, the participant avoided caffeine and vigorous exercise for at least 3 hours, waited at least 10 minutes after eating, and conducted sessions at approximately the same time of day to reduce normal fluctuations in heart rate. Listening volume was standardized by using a decibel meter app to set the headphones to the same volume level of about 60 to 65 decibels, and the volume was kept constant throughout all trials. Each trial began with a 3-minute baseline period. During this time, the participants sat quietly without moving or speaking. Heart rate readings were collected during the last 60 seconds of the baseline period and averaged to determine the baseline BPM. Immediately after the baseline measurement, the assigned music genre of either house or classical was played for 3 minutes. Heart rate measurements were again collected during the final 60 seconds of the listening period and averaged to obtain listening BPM. The change in heart rate, delta BPM, for each trial was calculated by subtracting the baseline average from the listening average. A total of 10 trials were completed, consisting of 5 house music trials and 5 classical music trials. The orders of genres was randomized across to prevent order effects. On days when more than one trial took place, a quiet 5-minute washout period was included between trials to allow heart rate to return to baseline. All data were recorded immediately after the trial. This included baseline BPM, listening BPM, delta and BPM, the measured volume level, the time of day, and deviations from the planned procedure. These data were later used to compute the mean and standard error for each music genre. Here we have several pictures of me during the experiment. On the top, we have all of the before pictures, and on the bottom, we have all the after pictures. As you can see, there are no apparent distinct changes in body language before or after. Methods 2. Standard error analysis was used to evaluate the data because the goal of the study was to compare the mean change in heart rate between two treatment groups, house music and classical music. This technique allowed the mean delta BPM for each genre to be calculated along with the standard error bars to determine whether the difference between the two genres appeared meaningful, or other people might say statistically significant. The sample size consisted of 10 total trials, with 5 trials completed for each group. Several steps were taken to reduce bias and control confounding variables during data collection. Listening volume was controlled by using the same headphones for every trial and setting the volume approximately to 60 to 65 decibels with the decibel meter app before each session. Order effects were minimized by randomizing the sequence in which music genres were tested across days and by using 5-minute quiet washout periods between trials completed on the same day. Additional confounding variables that were monitored included time of day, recent physical activity, caffeine intake, and predisposition because of familiarity to songs. Here is the data table. Below is presented all of the data recorded from the experiment. On the top, we have trial number, genre, baseline heart rate, listening heart rate, delta and BPM, volume and decibels, and the time of day. A conclusion to be drawn from the data is that house music consistently produced larger increases in heart rate compared to classical music. Across all 5 house trials, delta and BPM values range from 10 plus to 12 plus, indicating a strong, repeatable elevation in heart rate during listening. In heavy contrast, classical music produced much smaller changes, staying between a plus 3 and plus 4 BPM. Because baseline values and volume levels were kept consistent, These differences suggest that the faster tempo and higher entry of house music had a stronger short-term physiological effect on heart rate than classical music. Here are my standard error bar graphs. It is very obvious to see that house not only produced a higher mean change in BPM, but due to that, it had a higher variance. Now, this is not to say that the difference in between house and classical music is negligible. The standard errors still fall without each other's ranges. Therefore, we can conclude based on the study that mean change in BPM produced by house music is greater than that of classical music. Graph results slash conclusions. The bar graph shows that house music produced a much larger mean increase in heart rate compared to classical music. House trials had an average change of about 11.2 BPM, while classical trials showed only 3.2 BPM. And the standard error bars for the two genres did not overlap. Again, this indicates a clear difference between the two treatment groups. The results support the original hypothesis that house music would cause a greater short-term increase in heart rate. Even though this was not a formal significance test, the large gap between the two groups means that relative to their very small standard error values, that because this study compared two categorical variables, the difference is easily testable. Overall, the findings suggest that music genre can actually influence physiological arousal, with energetic music producing a stronger response. These results raise additional questions for future research, such as whether tempo, volume, familiarity, or personal music preference play a role in heart rate changes. This study also helped reveal possible improvements for future trials, such as increasing the sample size or adding multiple participants to strengthen generalizability. Original hypothesis. My original research question asked whether listening to house music versus classical music would produce different short-term changes in heart rate. Based on this question, my hypothesis predicted that house music would cause a larger positive change in heart rate compared to classical music. What might I do differently if I had to repeat this experiment? Looking back at the project, there were a few areas where the design and data collection could be improved. One very strong limitation was the small sample size. Since it was just me recording my own BPM and changes in BPM, we cannot accurately make extrapolations about what house music or classical music might do to somebody of a different race, gender, body weight, or musical preference. Thank you for your time and thank you for watching my presentation. Here's a full bibliography, and feel free to email me any questions or ask about other parts of the experiment that were not listed.